Hello, and welcome to tonight's journey through deep time. I'm the drowsy professor, and together we'll travel back to when the world's largest desert was a garden of rivers, lakes, and endless green horizons. As you settle into this ancient story of Earth's gentle transformations, let me know where in the world you're resting tonight and what time the evening has brought to your corner of our planet. Now, find your most comfortable position, close your eyes, and imagine stepping backward through thousands of years, and let's drift together into a time when the Sahara bloomed with life. Beneath the endless dunes of today's Sahara Desert lies a secret written in stone, sand, and the very bones of the earth itself. The memory of a time when this vast expanse of golden emptiness was a lush, green paradise that stretched from the Atlantic shores of West Africa to the Red Sea, supporting rivers that rivaled the Amazon, lakes larger than England, and grasslands that fed countless herds of animals whose descendants now roam only the savannas far to the south. Picture yourself standing at the edge of the Sahara as it exists today, feeling the dry heat radiating from sand dunes that seem to extend forever beneath the brilliant blue sky. The silence here is profound, broken only by the whisper of wind moving grains of sand in endless, patient redistribution. It seems impossible that this landscape of such beautiful desolation could ever have been anything else. Yet hidden beneath your feet lie the fossilized remains of crocodiles and hippos, the ancient channels of mighty rivers, and the calcium deposits of freshwater lakes that once reflected green shores and cloudy skies. The transformation of the Sahara from paradise to desert and back again represents one of Earth's most dramatic demonstrations of climate cycling, a gentle rhythm of change that operates on timescales so vast that human history occupies only the most recent chapter of the current dry period. This cycling between green abundance and golden aridity has repeated many times over millions of years, driven by subtle changes in Earth's orbital patterns that affect how solar energy reaches different parts of our planet during different seasons. As you rest comfortably tonight, you can imagine the Sahara as it existed roughly 8,000 years ago, during what scientists call the African Humid Period, a time when orbital cycles had shifted Earth's relationship with the Sun just enough to bring the tropical monsoon rains hundreds of miles further north than they reach today. The same astronomical forces that give us our seasons had slowly, gently nudged the climate system into a configuration that turned the Sahara green for several thousand years. Picture this transformation not as a sudden change, but as a gradual awakening that unfolded over centuries, with each year bringing slightly more rainfall than the last, each decade seeing the expansion of vegetation a little further into what had been barren land. The change was so gradual that if you could have lived through it, you might not have noticed the transformation from year to year. Yet over the span of human generations, it created one of the most remarkable landscape changes our planet has ever experienced. The orbital mechanics that drove this transformation operate according to cycles discovered by the mathematician Milutin Milankovitch, subtle variations in Earth's orbit and axial tilt that change the timing and intensity of seasons over periods of tens of thousands of years. During the time of the Green Sahara, Earth's orbit was slightly different from today's, bringing the planet closer to the Sun during summer months in the Northern Hemisphere, intensifying the seasonal heating that drives monsoon circulation. Imagine Earth as a great, slowly spinning dance partner with the Sun, sometimes leaning closer during northern summers, sometimes further away, sometimes tilting at slightly different angles, creating a cosmic choreography that plays out over millennia and determines the long-term rhythm of climate on our planet. The Green Sahara emerged during one movement of this ancient dance, when the steppes aligned to bring moisture and life to regions that today know only the whisper of dry wind through sand. The evidence for this ancient paradise lies scattered across the modern desert in forms that speak to patient scientific eyes trained to read the stories that landscapes tell. Rock art created by people who lived during the Green Sahara shows scenes of abundant wildlife, giraffes and elephants, cattle and antelope, crocodiles and fish, images that seem fantastical when viewed against today's desert backdrop, but represent careful records of a world that flourished where now only sand and stone remain. As you breathe slowly and peacefully, you can appreciate the deep patience required to uncover this ancient story. Scientists have spent decades analyzing sediment cores from ancient lake beds, studying the isotopic chemistry of fossil shells, mapping the courses of vanished rivers, and piecing together climate data from tree rings, ice cores, and marine sediments to reconstruct the detailed story of how the Sahara bloomed and faded in response to Earth's orbital rhythms. The transition into the Green Sahara began around 11,000 years ago, as the last ice age was ending and Earth's orbital configuration was shifting toward the pattern that would bring enhanced monsoon rains to North Africa. The change started at the southern edges of what is now the Sahara, where increased rainfall first allowed grasslands to expand northward into regions that had been arid for thousands of years. Picture the leading edge of this green transformation moving slowly northward across the landscape, year by year, decade by decade, as increased rainfall supported the gradual expansion of vegetation zones. Pioneer plants established themselves in favorable locations, near seasonal water sources, in depressions that collected runoff, along the courses of ephemeral streams that began flowing more frequently as the rains increased. The soils that supported this green transformation tell their own story of gradual change and patient accumulation. Where today's Sahara shows mostly sand and bare rock, geological evidence reveals layers of ancient soil formation, organic matter accumulation, and chemical signatures that indicate periods of sustained plant growth and biological activity. These paleosols, as scientists call ancient soils, represent the dark, rich earth that supported grasslands and forests across regions that now seem almost lifeless. The pace of this transformation matched the unhurried rhythms of natural change, unfolding over centuries rather than years, allowing ecosystems to establish themselves thoroughly before expanding further. This gradual pace ensured that the changes were stable and sustainable, creating robust ecological systems that could support diverse communities of plants and animals rather than just temporary green patches that might disappear with a few dry years. Consider how this ancient green period lasted for approximately 6,000 years, a span of time that encompasses all of recorded human history and extends far beyond it. The Green Sahara persisted for longer than the time between the construction of the first pyramids and the present day, representing not a brief climatic anomaly, but a sustained period of abundance that allowed complex ecosystems to develop and flourish. The memory of this green time persists not only in geological records, but in the genetic heritage of plants and animals that retreated to refuge areas as the desert gradually returned. Isolated populations of species that once ranged widely across the Green Sahara can still be found in scattered oases and highland areas, living reminders of the biological communities that once flourished across the vast expanses that are now covered by sand. As you continue to rest peacefully, you can imagine the deep story that every grain of Saharan sand carries within it. A history of movement and change, of landscapes that have transformed from ocean floor to mountain peak, to green savanna, to desert dune over the vast span of geological time. Each grain has witnessed countless cycles of abundance and scarcity, wetness and dryness, life and dormancy. The scientific understanding of the Green Sahara represents one of paleoclimatology's greatest success stories, demonstrating how multiple lines of evidence can be woven together to reconstruct detailed pictures of ancient environments. Satellite imagery reveals the courses of ancient rivers beneath modern sand seas, while archaeological excavations uncover the tools and settlements of people who live beside lakes that have been dry for thousands of years. Flowing across the Green Sahara of ancient times was a network of rivers that would have amazed anyone who could see today's parched landscape. Waterways that carried the abundant rainfall of enhanced monsoon seasons from highland watersheds through hundreds of miles of grassland and forest to reach the sea. These rivers carved channels that can still be detected beneath modern sand dunes, created floodplains that supported lush riparian forests, and provided the liquid arteries that carried life throughout the vast green heart of North Africa. Picture the largest of these ancient rivers, a waterway that scientists have named the Tamanrasset River, which flowed from the Hagar Mountains in what is now southern Algeria northward through hundreds of miles of green landscape to empty into the Mediterranean Sea near Tunisia. This river, which ceased flowing as the Sahara dried approximately 5,000 years ago, was comparable in size to major modern rivers, carrying seasonal floods and maintaining year-round flow through a landscape that today receives less than an inch of rainfall per year. The Tamanrasset River system demonstrates the remarkable transformation that enhanced monsoon rainfall could create across the Saharan region. Fed by tributaries that drain the highland areas where orographic lifting enhanced precipitation, this ancient river carved a valley system that extended across much of the Central Sahara, creating a corridor of intensive biological activity through landscapes that today seem almost lifeless. Imagine standing beside this ancient river during the height of the Green Sahara, feeling the cool moisture rising from flowing water, listening to the gentle sound of current moving over stones and fallen logs, watching the interplay of light and shadow as clouds moved across a sky that knew frequent rain rather than the relentless sunshine that characterizes the region today. The riverbanks would have been lined with trees whose roots could reach the permanent water table, creating ribbons of forest that extended along watercourses like green highways through the surrounding grasslands. The seasonal patterns of these ancient rivers followed the rhythm of the enhanced monsoon circulation that brought the Green Sahara into existence. During summer months, when intensified solar heating drew moist air far inland from the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, these rivers would have swollen with runoff from widespread rainfall, creating annual floods that deposited fertile sediments across broad floodplains and recharged the groundwater systems that supported dry season flow. Picture the annual flood cycles that would have characterized these ancient river systems, with waters rising gradually as the rainy season progressed, spilling across floodplains to create temporary wetlands that provided habitat for countless species of waterfowl, fish, and amphibians. These seasonal floods would have been gentle and predictable, following the natural rhythm of monsoon intensification and recession rather than the violent flash floods that characterize the rare rainfall events in today's desert. The Western Desert River, another major waterway that flowed through what is now the Egyptian Sahara, carried water from highland areas near the Red Sea westward across hundreds of miles of green landscape to join the ancestral Nile River system. This river created an extensive valley system that supported human settlements and provided habitat corridors that allowed African wildlife to range much further north than is possible today. As you rest comfortably tonight, you can imagine the sound of water flowing where now only wind moves through sand, the gentle murmur of streams moving through reed beds, the splash of waterfalls where rivers descended from highland areas, the quiet lapping of river water against muddy banks lined with vegetation. These sounds of flowing water would have provided a constant acoustic backdrop to life in the Green Sahara, creating soundscapes of abundance in regions that today know only the whisper of sand and the occasional call of desert-adapted birds. The tributary systems that fed these major rivers created an intricate network of smaller waterways that extended the influence of permanent water far into the surrounding landscape. Seasonal streams carried wet season runoff to the main rivers while creating chains of pools that persisted through dry periods, providing stepping stone habitat that allowed aquatic species to maintain populations across vast areas. Picture the smaller streams and seasonal watercourses that would have meandered through the Green Sahara's grasslands, creating sinuous lines of green vegetation visible from great distances across the gently rolling landscape. These waterways would have supported gallery forests of trees and shrubs, creating habitat diversity that supported different communities of animals and provided corridors for movement and migration across the green expanse. The groundwater systems that supported these ancient rivers tell their own story of abundance and gradual change. Deep aquifers that were recharged during the Green Sahara period still contain fossil water from those ancient times, water that fell as rain on green landscapes thousands of years ago and now lies trapped in underground reservoirs beneath the modern desert. This fossil groundwater represents a liquid memory of the time when rain was abundant and rivers flowed year-round across what is now the world's largest desert. The channels carved by these ancient rivers persist beneath modern sand seas as buried valleys that can be detected by satellite radar and ground-penetrating geophysical surveys. These paleochannels, filled with sediments deposited during the river's active periods, create linear features that extend for hundreds of miles beneath the surface, marking the courses of waterways that once supported extensive riparian ecosystems. Imagine the process of gradual channel filling that occurred as the climate slowly dried and rivers began carrying less water. Initially, the rivers would have maintained their channels even as flow decreased, but eventually, as rainfall continued to decline, sand and sediment began accumulating in the riverbeds, gradually burying the evidence of flowing water beneath layers of wind-blown material. The river deltas where these ancient waterways reached the sea created extensive wetland systems that supported some of the most diverse biological communities in the Green Sahara. These deltaic environments, where riverborne sediments met marine waters, provided habitat for both freshwater and saltwater species while creating productive ecosystems that supported large populations of fish, birds, and aquatic mammals. Picture the ancient Tamanrasset River Delta, where this major waterway reached the Mediterranean Sea after its journey across hundreds of miles of Green Sahara. This deltaic region would have supported extensive marshlands filled with papyrus and other wetland plants, creating habitats similar to the modern Nile Delta, but located hundreds of miles to the west. The biological productivity of such deltaic environments would have supported human populations and provided staging areas for migratory birds traveling between Europe and tropical Africa. The seasonal rhythm of river flow in the Green Sahara followed patterns that are difficult to imagine from today's perspective, with reliable annual cycles of flood and recession that supported the development of complex biological communities adapted to predictable water level changes. During flood season, rivers would spread across broad floodplains, creating temporary lakes and wetlands that provided breeding habitat for countless species. As the floodwaters receded, they would leave behind fertile sediments and pools of water that persisted through the dry season, maintaining aquatic habitat and supporting the dry season survival of species that required permanent water. This predictable cycle of flooding and recession allowed the evolution of specialized ecological communities that could take advantage of both flood season abundance and dry season concentration of resources around permanent water. The fish communities that inhabited these ancient rivers included species that today are found only in tropical African river systems hundreds of miles to the south. Fossil evidence reveals the presence of large catfish, lungfish, and other species that require permanent flowing water, demonstrating that these ancient rivers maintained sufficient flow to support complex aquatic ecosystems throughout the year. Picture schools of fish moving through the clear waters of ancient Saharan rivers, their movements creating ripples that caught the sunlight filtering through the canopy of riverside trees. These aquatic communities would have supported larger predators, including crocodiles and fishing birds, while providing protein sources for the human populations that established settlements along the riverbanks. The gradual disappearance of these rivers as the climate dried represents one of the most dramatic landscape changes documented in the geological record. As monsoon rainfall decreased due to ongoing orbital changes, river flow began to decline, initially seasonally and then permanently. The process was gradual enough that ecological communities had time to adapt by retreating to refuge areas around permanent springs and deep pools, but ultimately too severe to allow the maintenance of flowing rivers across the vast Saharan expanse. The final stages of river flow in the drying Sahara created chains of isolated pools and seasonal streams that persisted for centuries after continuous flow had ceased. These remnant water bodies provided final refuges for aquatic species and supported the last populations of large mammals in regions that would eventually become completely arid. Tonight, as you settle deeper into rest, You can imagine the gentle sound of water that once whispered across landscapes where now only sand shifts in the wind. The rivers of the green Sahara flowed for thousands of years, creating the liquid foundation for one of Africa's most remarkable periods of abundance, supporting ecosystems that rivaled today's most productive savannas in regions that now seem almost lifeless. These ancient waterways remind us that Earth's landscapes are far more dynamic and changeable than they appear during the brief span of human observation, constantly transforming in response to the slow dance of astronomical cycles that govern our planet's long-term climate rhythms. Stretching endlessly beneath the clouded skies of the ancient green Sahara lay vast grasslands that rolled like green seas across landscapes, where today only golden dunes mark the horizon. These were not the sparse, struggling grasses that managed to survive in today's desert margins, but lush, productive savannas that supported dense stands of nutritious grasses, scattered groves of acacia trees, and the countless herds of grazing animals that required such abundance to sustain their populations across the immense expanse of what was then one of Africa's most productive ecosystems. Picture yourself walking through these ancient grasslands on a morning when gentle rain clouds drifted across the sky, feeling the soft give of rich soil beneath your feet and the gentle brush of grass stems that reach to your waist or higher. The air would have been sweet with the scent of growing vegetation and moist earth, filled with the sounds of countless insects humming in the grass, birds calling from scattered trees, and the distant lowing of great herds moving slowly across the endless green expanse under skies that promised regular, life-giving rain. These Saharan grasslands formed the foundation of one of the most extensive savanna ecosystems that ever existed on Earth, covering millions of square miles with productive vegetation that converted abundant rainfall and rich soils into the biological energy that supported complex food webs extending from the smallest soil organisms to the largest mammalian herbivores. The grasses themselves represented dozens of species, each adapted to different soil conditions, moisture levels, and grazing pressures, creating a diverse botanical tapestry that provided nutrition and habitat for countless other species. The seasonal rhythm of growth and dormancy that characterized these ancient grasslands followed the reliable patterns of wet and dry seasons that came with the enhanced monsoon circulation. During the rainy months, when moisture-laden winds brought regular precipitation inland from the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, the grassland would explode into verdant growth, with fresh shoots emerging from winter-dormant root systems and creating waves of green that stretched to every horizon. As you rest comfortably tonight, you can imagine the sight of these seasonal grass renewals, with rain-awakened prairies turning from brown dormancy to emerald abundance in a matter of weeks. The transformation would have been visible from great distances, creating vast patterns of green that shifted and flowed across the landscape as growing conditions varied with local topography, soil depth, and water availability. These seasonal changes provided the visual cues that guided the movements of migrating herds and the hunting patterns of the human populations that lived within this grassland abundance. The soil systems that supported these productive grasslands tell a story of thousands of years of organic matter accumulation and biological activity that created some of the richest earth that ever existed in what is now the Sahara Desert. Deep, dark soils formed through the patient work of grassroots that penetrated many feet into the earth, decomposing vegetation that added organic matter year after year, and the activities of countless soil organisms that processed organic materials into the complex chemical forms that support plant growth. Picture the intricate underground world that existed beneath the visible grasslands, with root systems that extended far deeper than the grass blades visible above ground, creating vast networks of organic matter that stored carbon, retained moisture, and provided habitat for earthworms, beetles, microorganisms, and all the other soil-dwelling creatures that form the foundation of terrestrial ecosystems. This hidden underground community was perhaps even more diverse and productive than the visible grassland communities above. The grass species that dominated these ancient Saharan savannas included relatives of the nutritious grasses that still support Africa's remaining grassland ecosystems, but growing under climate conditions that allowed much greater productivity and biological diversity than exists in today's more arid environments. These grasses produced abundant seeds that provided food for countless species of granivorous birds and small mammals, while their leaves and stems supported the vast herds of grazing animals that characterize the green Sahara's megafauna. The scattered trees that dotted these grassland landscapes created additional habitat complexity that supported species requiring both open grassland and woodland resources. Ancient pollen records reveal the presence of various acacia species, baobab trees, and other woody plants that today are found only in the Sahel region hundreds of miles to the south. These trees provided shade for grazing animals during the heat of the day, nesting sites for birds, and browse for animals that required more woody vegetation in their diets. Imagine the visual beauty of these ancient tree-dotted grasslands, with widely scattered giants rising above the sea of grass, their canopies providing islands of shade that attracted concentrations of wildlife during the heat of midday. The spacing of these trees followed natural patterns determined by competition for water and nutrients, creating park-like landscapes that combine the openness necessary for grass growth with the vertical habitat diversity that trees provide. The fire ecology that helped maintain these grassland systems operated according to natural patterns that prevented excessive woody plant encroachment while promoting the growth of fire-adapted grasses. Lightning-ignited fires during dry seasons would have swept across portions of the grasslands, burning accumulated dead vegetation and creating the mineral-rich ash deposits that enhance soil fertility for the following growing season. Picture the gentle passage of these natural fires across the ancient grasslands, moving slowly enough to allow most animals to escape while performing the essential ecological function of preventing brush encroachment and maintaining the open character necessary for productive grass growth. The smoke from these fires would have been visible from great distances, creating atmospheric displays that marked the seasonal rhythms of grassland renewal and ecological maintenance. The grazing patterns created by the vast herds of herbivores that inhabited these grasslands formed an essential part of the ecosystem's function, with different species utilizing different grass species and growth stages, creating the complex mosaic of grazing pressure that maintained grassland diversity and productivity. Heavy grazing in some areas stimulated grass growth and prevented dominance by single species, while lighter grazing in other areas allowed grasses to complete their reproductive cycles and maintain genetic diversity. The nutrient cycling that occurred within these grassland ecosystems represented one of nature's most efficient systems for converting rainfall and solar energy into biological productivity. Grazing animals consumed grass and converted it into protein while depositing nutrient-rich manure that fertilized the soil for continued grass growth. When these animals died, their bodies decomposed to provide additional nutrients for plant growth, creating closed-loop systems that sustained high productivity over thousands of years. Consider the seasonal migrations that would have characterized animal movements across these vast grasslands, with herds following the patterns of grass growth and water availability across landscapes so extensive that migration routes could span hundreds of miles. These movements would have created constantly shifting patterns of grazing pressure that allowed different areas to recover from heavy use, while ensuring that no part of the grassland system remained ungrazed for extended periods. The insect communities that inhabited these ancient grasslands included countless species of grass-feeding beetles, moths, grasshoppers, and other herbivorous insects that formed crucial links in grassland food webs. These insects converted grass into protein while providing food for the countless insectivorous birds, reptiles, and small mammals that characterize grassland animal communities. The sound of these insect communities would have created a constant background chorus that varied with season, time of day, and local grass productivity. Picture summer evenings in these ancient grasslands, with the air filled with the songs of countless insects creating complex harmonies that rose and fell with the cooling temperatures, while fireflies began their nightly displays and the calls of nightjars and other nocturnal birds added their voices to the grassland symphony. These soundscapes of abundance would have provided acoustic evidence of the biological productivity that characterized the green Sahara's grassland ecosystems. The pollinator communities that serviced the diverse flowering plants scattered throughout these grasslands included numerous species of bees, butterflies, and other insects that maintained the reproductive cycles of both grasses and the wildflowers that added seasonal color to the green expanse. These pollinators followed blooming cycles that extended throughout the growing season, ensuring that different plant species could reproduce while providing nectar and pollen resources that sustained pollinator populations. The seed dispersal networks that connected different parts of these vast grasslands included both wind dispersal of grass seeds and animal dispersal of the seeds of trees and shrubs. Migrating herds carried seeds in their digestive systems and on their bodies across great distances, helping to maintain genetic connectivity across the enormous expanse of grassland habitat, while facilitating the colonization of disturbed areas and the expansion of plant populations into newly suitable habitat. As the seasons progressed through their annual cycles, these grasslands would have displayed constantly changing colors and textures, from the fresh green of new growth during early rainy season to the golden browns and tans of mature and dormant grasses during dry periods. The visual beauty of these seasonal changes would have provided natural calendars that guided the activities of both wildlife and human populations across the vast grassland expanse. The transition zones where grasslands met other habitat types created additional ecological complexity that supported species requiring resources from multiple habitat types. Along rivers and lakes, grasslands graded into wetland vegetation that provided habitat for waterfowl and other aquatic species. Near highland areas, grasslands transitioned into woodland and forest communities that supported different suites of species while providing habitat connectivity across elevation gradients. The long-term stability of these grassland ecosystems during the thousands of years of the Green Sahara period demonstrates the sustainability of ecological systems that develop under stable climate conditions over extended time periods. Unlike modern grasslands that often face rapid environmental changes, these ancient Saharan grasslands had centuries to develop complex ecological relationships and efficient nutrient cycling systems that maintained high productivity without depleting soil resources. The root systems that anchored these ancient grasslands extended many feet into the soil, creating vast underground networks that stored carbon, stabilized soil against erosion, and maintained access to groundwater during dry periods. These deep root systems represented massive investments of plant energy that paid dividends in terms of drought resistance and long-term ecosystem stability, allowing the grasslands to persist through occasional dry years while maintaining overall productivity. Tonight, as you drift toward deeper rest, you can imagine the gentle rustling of ancient grasses in the evening breeze, the sweet scent of growing vegetation after rain, and the peaceful abundance of landscapes where vast grasslands stretched to every horizon under skies that brought regular, life-giving rain. These ancient Saharan grasslands remind us that Earth's landscapes are capable of transformations that exceed our everyday experience, creating periods of abundance in regions that today seem almost lifeless, demonstrating the remarkable potential for renewal that lies dormant in landscapes awaiting the return of favorable climate conditions. Imagine the first tentative raindrops falling on landscapes that had known drought for thousands of years, each drop creating tiny dark circles in the dust as the orbital cycles that govern Earth's long-term climate slowly shifted the monsoon patterns northward, bringing moisture-laden winds hundreds of miles further inland than they had reached for millennia. This return of regular rainfall to the Saharan region represents one of the most gentle yet transformative climate changes documented in Earth's history, unfolding over centuries with such gradual persistence that each generation of plants and animals could adapt to slightly wetter conditions than their ancestors had known. Picture these early rains not as sudden deluges that would overwhelm a landscape unprepared for water, but as gentle increasingly frequent showers that arrived with the patient rhythm of astronomical cycles operating over thousands of years. The return of moisture began subtly, with occasional wet years interrupting the normal pattern of persistent drought, creating brief windows of opportunity for dormant seeds to germinate, dried root systems to reactivate, and pioneer species to establish themselves in locations that would become stepping stones for the gradual expansion of green life across the ancient desert. The atmospheric mechanics that brought these transformative rains to the Sahara operated according to the same principles that drive monsoon circulation today, but enhanced and redirected by the orbital configuration that characterized Earth's position relative to the Sun during the early Holocene period. Enhanced solar heating during Northern Hemisphere summers, caused by Earth's closer approach to the Sun during summer months in that ancient time, created stronger thermal contrast between land and ocean that drew moisture-bearing winds much further inland than modern circulation patterns allow. As you rest peacefully tonight, you can imagine the vast atmospheric rivers of moisture that began flowing inland from the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, carrying water vapor across thousands of miles of increasingly green landscape to fall as rain over regions that today receive virtually no precipitation. These atmospheric moisture flows operated like invisible highways in the sky, transporting the water that would transform one of Earth's most arid regions into one of its most productive ecosystems. The seasonal rhythm of these returning rains followed patterns that became more pronounced and reliable with each passing century, as orbital cycles continued their slow enhancement of monsoon circulation. Initially, the increased rainfall might have been noticeable only to the most sensitive observers. Slightly more frequent storms during wet seasons, occasional showers during months that normally remained completely dry, gradual increases in the moisture content of soils that have been parched for generations. Picture the gradual strengthening of wet season patterns as the orbital enhancement of solar heating continued, with each decade bringing slightly more reliable rainfall, each century witnessing the establishment of more robust wet season circulation. Each millennium marked by the expansion of monsoon influence further into regions that had long known only the whisper of dry wind across sand and stone. The cloud formations that began appearing over the transforming Sahara would have seemed miraculous to any observer who had known only the cloudless skies that characterize the region today. These were not the thin, scattered clouds that occasionally drift across modern Saharan skies, but the substantial cumulus and cumulonimbus formations that develop when moist air masses encounter the thermal heating necessary to drive convective circulation and precipitation formation. Imagine watching the development of these ancient rain clouds as they built through morning hours, starting as small wisps of vapor rising from sun-heated surfaces, gradually accumulating moisture and vertical development as atmospheric instability grew through the day, finally reaching the towering heights necessary to produce the afternoon and evening thunderstorms that became the reliable pattern of wet season weather across the greening Sahara. The sound of thunder rolling across landscapes that had been silent except for wind would have announced the arrival of each storm system, creating acoustic experiences that marked the return of active weather to regions where rain had been unknown for thousands of years. These thunderstorms brought not just the water necessary for plant growth, but also the dramatic atmospheric displays that accompanied the transformation of one of Earth's most arid regions into a land of regular precipitation. Picture lightning illuminating the vast expanse of transforming landscape, revealing glimpses of green vegetation spreading across terrain that had been barren, while thunder echoed across distances measured in hundreds of miles, carrying the sound of atmospheric change to regions still waiting for their turn in the gradual progression of climate transformation that was bringing life back to the ancient desert. The timing of these returning rains followed the astronomical cycles that enhanced summer solar heating, creating predictable seasonal patterns that allowed vegetation to adapt to reliable wet and dry periods. During the enhanced summer months, when orbital mechanics brought Earth closer to the Sun, intensified heating created the strong thermal contrasts that drew monsoon circulation far inland, while during winter months, Reduced heating allowed the system to relax into patterns that provided the dry season rest periods necessary for many plant and animal species. The temperature patterns that accompanied these returning rains created climate conditions that were not only wetter than today's Sahara, but also more moderate in their extremes. Cloud cover and increased humidity reduced the intense daytime heating that characterizes modern desert conditions, while the thermal mass of increased vegetation and soil moisture moderated nighttime cooling, creating temperature ranges that were far more comfortable for biological activity than the extreme daily temperature swings that characterize arid environments. Consider how these gentler temperature patterns, combined with adequate rainfall, created conditions that could support the diverse biological communities that flourished during the Green Sahara period. The thermal stress that limits biological activity in modern desert environments was greatly reduced during the humid period, allowing plants and animals to remain active for longer periods each day and throughout more of the year. The humidity levels that accompanied the return of regular rainfall created atmospheric conditions that were dramatically different from today's extremely dry air. Higher humidity reduced water stress on vegetation, decreased evaporation rates that allowed surface water to persist longer, and created the atmospheric moisture content necessary to support cloud formation and continued precipitation development. Picture the feeling of this more humid air on your skin, the relief from the desiccating dryness that characterizes modern Saharan conditions, the comfortable sensation of breathing air that contained adequate moisture to support respiratory comfort, rather than the parching dryness that makes modern desert air so challenging for biological systems adapted to more moderate humidity levels. The wind patterns that developed during the humid period brought not just moisture, but also the moderate air circulation that distributed rainfall across vast areas and prevented the development of extreme weather conditions. Instead of the harsh, dust-laden winds that sweep across today's desert, the Green Sahara experienced gentle breezes that carried the sweet scents of growing vegetation and the promise of regular precipitation. The pressure systems that organized these beneficial wind patterns operated according to the same principles that drive modern weather, but with the enhanced energy and moisture content that came with strengthened monsoon circulation. Low-pressure systems developed more frequently and intensively over the heated landmass, creating the circulation patterns that drew moist air inland, while organizing precipitation into the patterns that provided water where and when vegetation most needed it. Imagine the atmospheric circulation during the height of the Green Sahara's rainy season, with vast low-pressure systems organizing weather patterns across the entire North African region, drawing moisture from ocean sources thousands of miles away and distributing it through precipitation systems that brought life-giving water to landscapes extending from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. The gradual intensification of these rainfall patterns over centuries allowed soil systems to develop the water-holding capacity necessary to support the abundant vegetation that characterized the Green Sahara. Initially, rain falling on degraded desert soils would have been largely lost to runoff, but as organic matter began accumulating and soil structure improved, the landscape's ability to capture and retain precipitation increased dramatically. Picture the progressive improvement in the landscape's water-holding capacity as decades of increased organic matter accumulation created soils that could absorb and store the rainfall that had previously been lost to surface runoff. This positive feedback between vegetation establishment and soil development helped amplify the effects of increased precipitation, allowing relatively modest increases in annual rainfall to support much more dramatic increases in vegetation productivity. The regional variations in rainfall patterns across the vast expanse of the transforming Sahara created a mosaic of different ecological conditions that supported the development of diverse habitat types. Highland areas that intercepted moisture-laden air masses received higher precipitation totals that supported woodland and forest development, while lowland areas received moderate rainfall that supported grassland and savanna ecosystems. The reliability of these precipitation patterns during the thousands of years of the Green Sahara period provided the climatic stability necessary for the development of complex ecological communities. Unlike modern semi-arid regions that often experience high variability in annual precipitation, The orbital enhancement of monsoon circulation created conditions where rainfall was dependable enough to support long-term ecosystem development and the establishment of species that required predictable water availability. Consider how this climatic reliability allowed the evolution of specialized ecological relationships and the development of efficient nutrient cycling systems that could not persist under highly variable precipitation regimes. The thousands of years of stable, adequate rainfall provided the temporal foundation for the remarkable biological productivity that characterized the Green Sahara period. The end-of-storm atmospheric conditions that followed these ancient rainfall events would have been filled with the fresh scents of wet earth and growing vegetation. The sounds of water dripping from leaves and flowing in temporary streams, and the visual beauty of landscapes transformed by moisture from brown dormancy to emerging green life. Picture the aftermath of these life-giving storms, with the air clean and sweet from atmospheric washing, the earth dark with moisture that would support weeks of plant growth, and the entire landscape seeming to exhale in relief as plants and soils absorb the water that would sustain biological activity until the next rainfall event. The long-term persistence of these favorable rainfall patterns for thousands of years demonstrates the stability of orbital climate forcing and its ability to maintain enhanced precipitation over timescales much longer than typical human experience with climate variation. This temporal stability provided the foundation for one of Earth's most remarkable ecosystem transformations, showing how gradual astronomical changes can create sustained environmental changes that support the development of entirely different biological communities. Tonight, as you settle into deeper rest, you can imagine the gentle sound of these ancient rains falling on awakening landscapes, the sweet scent of wet earth that had been dry for millennia, and the peaceful transformation of vast expanses of desert into the well-watered gardens that supported some of Africa's most abundant ecosystems. These returning rains remind us that climate change can be a gentle, beneficial process when it unfolds at natural timescales, bringing life and abundance to landscapes that patience and orbital mechanics prepare for renewal. As the returning rains soaked into soils that had been dormant for thousands of years, life began to stir throughout the transforming Sahara with the patient persistence that characterizes nature's response to favorable conditions. This awakening was not a sudden explosion of biological activity, but rather a gentle, progressive colonization that unfolded over centuries as plants and animals gradually expanded their ranges northward from refuge areas in the south, establishing new populations and habitats that were slowly becoming suitable for species that had long been excluded from the arid Saharan region. Picture the first tentative pioneers, perhaps hardy grasses whose wind-blown seeds found purchase in newly moistened soil, or small shrubs whose deep root systems could take advantage of improved groundwater conditions. These pioneer species established themselves cautiously at first, growing slowly in scattered favorable locations, gradually building populations that could serve as stepping stones for further expansion as climate conditions continued to improve with each passing century. The plant communities that began colonizing the greening Sahara included species whose modern descendants now thrive in the Sahel and Sudanian savanna regions hundreds of miles to the south, but which during the humid period were able to extend their ranges far into what had been the heart of the desert. These were not random collections of plants scattered across the landscape, but organized communities that developed over time through the patient process of ecological succession and competitive sorting that creates stable, productive ecosystems. As you rest comfortably tonight, you can imagine the gradual development of these plant communities, starting with the hardiest pioneer species that could tolerate the variable conditions of a transitional climate, followed by successive waves of colonization by species that required more stable, favorable conditions. Each new species that established itself created habitat and resources that made the environment more suitable for additional species, generating positive feedback loops that accelerated the pace of biological colonization. The acacia trees that began dotting the developing grasslands represented one of the most important colonization successes, creating islands of enhanced habitat that supported numerous other species, while demonstrating the remarkable adaptability that allowed African woody plants to take advantage of improved moisture conditions. These acacias, with their deep root systems and drought-tolerant physiology, serve as pioneer trees that could establish themselves during the early phases of climate improvement and persist through occasional dry periods. Picture these scattered acacias as they began appearing across the landscape, each tree representing a successful long-distance colonization event and creating around itself a zone of enhanced biological activity. Birds roost in their branches and dispersed seeds in their droppings, creating patches of diverse vegetation beneath the canopy. Small mammals sought shelter in their shade, while their root systems improved soil conditions for other plants trying to establish themselves. The animal colonization that followed plant establishment brought species that today are considered quintessentially African, but which during the Green Sahara period range hundreds of miles north of their current distributions. Archaeological evidence reveals the presence of elephants, rhinoceros, hippopotamus, giraffes, lions, leopards, and countless species of antelope that found abundant food and water in landscapes that now support only the most drought-adapted desert species. The elephants that roamed the Green Sahara grasslands represented one of the most remarkable examples of successful large mammal colonization, requiring vast amounts of vegetation and water, while creating through their feeding and movement patterns the habitat disturbance that many grassland species require for optimal growth. These ancient Saharan elephants followed migration routes that may have extended for hundreds of miles, connecting different seasonal resource areas across the vast expanse of green habitat. Imagine herds of elephants moving slowly across the ancient grasslands, their massive forms creating paths through tall grass, while their feeding activities created the mosaic of grazed and ungrazed areas that supported maximum plant diversity. The sound of their rumbling communications would have carried for miles across the open landscape, providing acoustic evidence of the megafauna abundance that characterized the Green Sahara's peak productivity. The rhinoceros populations that established themselves in the Green Sahara included both black and white rhino species, whose different feeding strategies allowed them to utilize different aspects of the diverse plant communities that developed as ecological succession progressed. Black rhinos browsed on shrubs and small trees, while white rhinos grazed on grasses, demonstrating the niche partitioning that allowed multiple large herbivore species to coexist in the abundant ecosystems. The hippopotamus populations that colonized the rivers and lakes of the Green Sahara provide dramatic evidence of just how different aquatic conditions were during the humid period compared to today's virtually waterless landscape. These semi-aquatic giants required permanent water bodies large enough to support their massive bulk while providing the aquatic vegetation that formed the bulk of their diet. Picture pods of hippos wallowing in the permanent pools of ancient Saharan rivers, their bulky forms creating wakes in waters that reflected green shores lined with papyrus and other wetland vegetation. The deep, grunting calls of these aquatic herbivores would have echoed across water surfaces that are now buried beneath hundreds of feet of sand, providing soundtrack evidence of the aquatic abundance that characterized the Green Sahara's riverine ecosystems. The giraffe populations that spread across the Green Sahara found abundant browse in the acacia woodlands that developed in areas with especially favorable moisture conditions. These tallest of African mammals could reach vegetation unavailable to other herbivores, while their long-distance vision allowed them to spot predators and other giraffes across the vast open spaces of the developing savanna ecosystems. The carnivore communities that followed herbivore colonization included lions, leopards, cheetahs, and wild dogs that found abundant prey in the diverse herbivore populations while establishing territorial systems that spanned the vast areas necessary to support viable predator populations. These predators played crucial roles in shaping herbivore behavior and population dynamics, while creating the selection pressures that maintain the alertness and physical conditioning of prey species. Imagine the night sounds of the Green Sahara when these predator communities were active. The roaring of lions that could be heard for miles across the open grasslands, the coughing calls of leopards from scattered trees, the yipping of wild dog packs coordinating their hunting activities. These acoustic signatures of predator presence would have shaped the behavior of all other species, while providing auditory evidence of the complex predator-prey relationships that characterized these ancient ecosystems. The bird communities that colonized the Green Sahara included both resident species that established permanent populations and migratory species that incorporated the newly green landscapes into their seasonal movement patterns. Ostriches strutted across open grasslands, secretary birds hunted small mammals and reptiles, and countless species of seed-eating birds took advantage of the abundant grass seed production. The waterfowl communities that established themselves around the lakes and rivers of the Green Sahara included ducks, geese, herons, flamingos, and pelicans that found abundant aquatic food resources in the productive wetland ecosystems. These waterbirds created some of the most spectacular wildlife concentrations in the Green Sahara, with thousands of individuals gathering during favorable seasons to take advantage of concentrated food resources. Picture the sight of vast flocks of flamingos feeding in the shallow waters of ancient Saharan lakes, their pink forms creating living carpets of color against the blue water and green shores. The sound of their collective calling would have carried for miles, while their filter feeding activities helped process the abundant plankton production that characterized these productive aquatic ecosystems. The reptile and amphibian communities that colonized the Green Sahara included crocodiles in the permanent water bodies, various species of lizards and snakes that found abundant prey in the diverse small mammal and bird populations, and frogs and toads that took advantage of seasonal pools and permanent wetlands for reproduction. Crocodiles in particular provide dramatic evidence of just how different aquatic conditions were, requiring permanent water and abundant fish populations for survival. The insect communities that established themselves throughout the Green Sahara formed the foundation of food webs that supported the abundant bird and small mammal populations, while providing pollination services for the diverse plant communities. These invertebrate communities included countless species of beetles, butterflies, bees, ants, and other insects that processed organic matter, pollinated flowers, and provided protein for countless other species. Consider the complexity of ecological relationships that developed as different species established themselves and began interacting in ways that created the stable community structures characteristic of mature ecosystems. Predator-prey relationships, competitive interactions, mutualistic partnerships, and countless other ecological connections developed over centuries to create the intricate biological communities that characterize the Green Sahara at its peak. The pollination networks that connected flowering plants with their insect partners created some of the most important ecological relationships in the developing ecosystems, ensuring plant reproduction while providing nectar and pollen resources that supported diverse pollinator communities. These pollination services were essential for maintaining plant genetic diversity and supporting the reproduction of species that required cross-pollination for successful seed production. The seed dispersal networks that developed as animal and plant communities became established created the connectivity necessary for plant species to colonize new habitat and maintain genetic exchange across vast areas. Large mammals dispersed seeds in their dung across migration routes that could span hundreds of miles, while birds carried seeds between different habitat patches and water sources. Picture the gradual expansion of species ranges as successful colonization events created new source populations that could serve as stepping stones for further expansion. Each successfully established population increased the probability that the species could colonize additional suitable habitat, creating positive feedback loops that accelerated the pace of biological colonization across the vast expanse of improving habitat. The adaptation processes that occurred as species established themselves in the Green Sahara included both behavioral adjustments to new ecological conditions and genetic adaptation to local environmental conditions. Species that successfully colonized the Green Sahara often developed local adaptations that allowed them to take advantage of the specific opportunities and challenges presented by these transitional ecosystems. The habitat connectivity that developed as biological communities became established across the Green Sahara created corridors for movement and gene flow that connected previously isolated populations while allowing species to track favorable conditions across the vast landscape. This connectivity was essential for maintaining viable populations of species that required large territories or seasonal migration routes. As the biological communities of the Green Sahara matured over thousands of years, they developed the complex ecological relationships and efficient nutrient cycling that characterize stable, productive ecosystems. Species interactions became more sophisticated, community structure became more complex, and ecosystem functions became more efficient at converting available resources into biological productivity. Tonight, as you settle deeper into rest, you can imagine the gentle sounds of this awakening life. The distant trumpeting of elephant herds, the evening chorus of frogs from seasonal pools, the rustle of small mammals moving through dense grass, and the myriad insect sounds that provided the acoustic backdrop for one of Africa's most remarkable periods of biological abundance. This awakening of life in the ancient Sahara reminds us that landscapes have the capacity for transformation that exceeds our everyday experience, demonstrating nature's patient ability to colonize and develop complex ecosystems when favorable conditions persist over sufficient timescales. Scattered across the green expanse of the ancient Sahara, like jewels reflecting the clouded sky, lay hundreds of freshwater lakes, some small enough to walk around in an afternoon, others so vast that their far shores disappeared beyond the horizon, creating inland seas that supported complex aquatic ecosystems and provided the permanent water sources that allowed diverse biological communities to flourish in regions where today not a single natural water body remains. These ancient lakes represented some of the most productive and biologically diverse ecosystems in the Green Sahara, serving as focal points for wildlife concentration and supporting aquatic communities that rivaled the Great Lakes of modern East Africa. Picture yourself standing on the shore of one of these ancient Saharan lakes during the height of the humid period, feeling the gentle lapping of waves against a shoreline lined with papyrus and other emergent vegetation, breathing air sweetened by the moisture rising from thousands of square miles of open water, and listening to the calls of countless water birds that have found abundant food and nesting habitat in this aquatic paradise that existed where today only sand dunes mark the horizon. The largest of these ancient lakes, known to modern scientists as Lake Megachad, covered an area comparable to the Caspian Sea, stretching across parts of what are now Chad, Niger, Nigeria, and Cameroon. This enormous body of fresh water was fed by rivers that drained vast watersheds extending across much of the Green Sahara, creating a lake system so large that it influenced regional weather patterns and supported aquatic ecosystems of remarkable diversity and productivity. Imagine the scale of this ancient inland sea, with shorelines that extended for thousands of miles through landscapes of reedy marshes, sandy beaches, and forested headlands where rivers entered the lake carrying the runoff from distant highlands. The open waters of Lake Megachad would have generated their own weather patterns, with lake-effect precipitation enhancing rainfall in surrounding areas while moderating temperature extremes through the thermal mass of this enormous water body. The smaller lakes that dotted the Green Sahara landscape included hundreds of water bodies, ranging from seasonal ponds that filled during rainy periods to permanent lakes fed by springs and streams that maintained water levels throughout annual dry seasons. These smaller lakes created a network of aquatic habitat that provided stepping-stone connections for aquatic species while supporting the water needs of terrestrial species across the vast expanse of green savanna. Picture the diversity of these ancient lake systems, from deep, clear lakes in highland areas where cold springs emerged from underground aquifers, to shallow, warm lakes in lowland areas where seasonal streams deposited sediments rich in nutrients that supported abundant plankton growth. Each lake developed its own unique characteristics based on local geology, hydrology, and the specific combination of species that colonized its waters. The water chemistry of these ancient Saharan lakes varied considerably depending on their geological settings and water sources, creating diverse aquatic environments that supported different combinations of species. Some lakes were fed primarily by surface runoff and maintained relatively dilute freshwater conditions, while others received significant groundwater input that created slightly alkaline or mineral-rich conditions favoring different types of aquatic life. The seasonal cycles that characterize these lake systems followed the patterns of wet and dry seasons that came with enhanced monsoon circulation, with water levels rising during rainy periods and falling during dry seasons in predictable patterns that allowed aquatic and shoreline species to adapt their life cycles to take advantage of changing conditions. These seasonal water level fluctuations created productive littoral zones where aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems met and intermingled. As you rest peacefully tonight, you can imagine the gentle rise and fall of water levels in these ancient lakes, exposing mudflats during dry seasons that provided feeding areas for countless shorebirds, then flooding these same areas during wet seasons to create shallow nursery areas where fish could spawn and young aquatic animals could find protection from predators in the dense vegetation of flooded grasslands. The fish communities that colonized these ancient Saharan lakes included species whose modern relatives are found in the Great Lakes of East Africa and the river systems of tropical West Africa. These fish populations included large predatory species like Nile perch that controlled smaller fish populations, cyprinids that fed on plankton and plant material, and catfish that scavenged organic matter from lake bottoms while growing to enormous sizes in the productive waters. Picture schools of fish moving through the clear waters of these ancient lakes, their silvery forms flashing in the sunlight that penetrated the clean water while creating ripples on the surface that reflected the green shores and clouded skies. These fish populations provided food for the countless fish-eating birds, crocodiles, and other aquatopredators that made these lakes among the most productive ecosystems in the ancient Sahara. The crocodile populations that inhabited the larger lakes and connecting rivers included both Nile crocodiles and other species that found abundant food in the diverse fish populations while creating through their presence the predation pressure that shaped the behavior and evolution of other aquatic species. These apex predators grew to impressive sizes in the food-rich waters, with some individuals reaching lengths that would have made them among the largest crocodiles that ever existed. Imagine the sight of large crocodiles basking on muddy shorelines or floating motionless in shallow waters, their presence creating zones of heightened alertness among the countless animals that came to drink at the water's edge. The deep, bellowing calls of these ancient predators would have carried across the water for miles, providing acoustic warnings that influenced the behavior of all other species in the lake ecosystems. The hippopotamus populations that wallowed in the shallows of these ancient lakes created some of the most dramatic evidence of just how different aquatic conditions were during the Green Sahara period. These massive, semi-aquatic herbivores required deep, permanent water for thermoregulation and protection, while their grazing activities on shoreline vegetation helped maintain the open structure of littoral zones and created pathways that other species used for access to water. Picture pods of hippos emerging from lake waters in the evening to graze on the lush grasslands that extended to the water's edge, their massive forms creating well-worn trails for the vegetation, while their nighttime feeding activities helped maintain the park-like structure of lakeside savannas. The territorial disputes and social interactions of these ancient Saharan hippos would have created dramatic acoustic displays that carried across the quiet waters. The bird communities that made these ancient lakes their home included some of the most spectacular waterfowl concentrations that ever existed in Africa. Flamingo populations numbered in the millions, creating vast pink carpets on the surface of alkaline lakes, where they fed on abundant blue-green algae and small crustaceans. Pelican colonies occupied islands and shoreline areas, while countless species of ducks, geese, herons, and other water birds found abundant food and nesting habitat. Imagine the morning cacophony of bird calls rising from these ancient lake systems as dawn light revealed the incredible abundance and diversity of waterbird life. The honking of geese, the trumpeting of cranes, the chattering of countless smaller species, and the collective murmur of flamingo flocks would have created symphonies of abundance that demonstrated the remarkable productivity of these aquatic ecosystems. The seasonal migrations that connected these ancient Saharan lakes with other African ecosystems created some of the most extensive bird movement patterns that ever existed on the continent. Species that bred in the lake systems during favorable seasons would disperse across vast areas during other parts of the year, while migrants from other regions would arrive to take advantage of the abundant food resources that these productive waters provided. The plankton communities that formed the foundation of these lake food webs included countless species of algae, bacteria, protozoa, and small crustaceans that converted nutrients and solar energy into the biological productivity that supported all higher levels of aquatic life. These microscopic communities reached densities that created visibly colored water during peak productivity periods, providing the energy base that allowed these lakes to support such abundant fish and bird populations. Picture the seasonal blooms of plankton that would have colored the waters of these ancient lakes in shades of green, brown, and even red as different species peaked in abundance during favorable conditions. These plankton blooms represented massive concentrations of biological energy that provided food for filter-feeding fish and invertebrates while creating the oxygen-rich conditions that supported diverse aquatic communities. The shoreline vegetation that surrounded these ancient lakes created complex transitional ecosystems where aquatic and terrestrial species interacted in productive edge environments. Papyrus marshes extended into shallow waters, providing nesting habitat for countless bird species while creating the structured habitat that supported diverse fish and invertebrate communities. Sedges and rushes formed dense stands that provided cover for small mammals and amphibians. The thermal stratification that developed in the deeper lakes during warm seasons created vertical habitat diversity that supported different species at different depths, with cool, oxygen-rich bottom waters providing habitat for cold-adapted species, while warm surface waters supported tropical fish and plankton communities. This vertical habitat complexity allowed these lakes to support greater species diversity than would have been possible in more uniform aquatic environments. Consider the nutrient cycling that occurred within these ancient lake ecosystems, with organic matter from surrounding terrestrial ecosystems washing into the lakes during rainy seasons, providing the nutrients necessary to support abundant plankton growth. Fish and bird populations processed these nutrients and redistributed them throughout the ecosystem while creating the complex food webs that characterize these productive aquatic systems. The connectivity between different lakes through river systems and seasonal flooding created opportunities for genetic exchange and species movement that maintain the diversity and resilience of aquatic communities across the vast network of water bodies. During high water periods, previously isolated lakes might become connected through temporary channels that allowed fish and other aquatic species to colonize new habitat. Picture the landscape during peak flood seasons when rising waters connected normally separate lakes into vast temporary wetland systems that provided unprecedented opportunities for aquatic species movement and genetic exchange. These flood connections created pulses of biological activity that enhanced the productivity and diversity of the entire regional aquatic ecosystem. The sediment records preserved in the bottom deposits of these ancient lakes provide detailed archives of environmental change that allow modern scientists to reconstruct the history of these remarkable aquatic ecosystems. Layers of organic-rich sediments deposited during productive periods alternate with mineral layers that mark times of lower productivity, creating detailed timelines of ecological change that span thousands of years. The eventual drying of these lakes, as the climate gradually returned to arid conditions, represents one of the most dramatic ecosystem transformations documented in the geological record. As rainfall decreased and water levels fell, these vast aquatic ecosystems gradually contracted to smaller and smaller refugia before eventually disappearing entirely, leaving behind only the sedimentary evidence of their former abundance. The speed of this drying process varied among different lakes, with some maintaining water for centuries after others had disappeared, creating final refugia that supported remnant aquatic communities long after the surrounding landscape had returned to desert conditions. These last remaining water bodies became concentration points for the final populations of aquatic species before they too succumbed to the inexorable return of aridity. Tonight, as you drift toward deeper rest, you can imagine the gentle sounds of water lapping against ancient shorelines, the calls of countless waterbirds echoing across vast lake surfaces, and the peaceful abundance of aquatic ecosystems that supported some of the most diverse and productive biological communities that ever existed in what is now the world's largest desert. These ancient lakes remind us that even the most arid landscapes retain the potential for aquatic abundance when orbital cycles align to bring adequate moisture to regions patient enough to await the return of favorable conditions. Walking softly across the green grasslands and along the shores of ancient lakes came the first human populations to discover the abundant paradise that the Sahara had become, nomadic peoples who followed expanding savannas northward from tropical Africa, bringing with them the knowledge and skills that would allow them to thrive in landscapes that offered unprecedented opportunities for hunting, fishing, gathering, and eventually the earliest experiments in animal domestication and agriculture that would transform human society. These were not the struggling survivors that we might imagine trying to eke out existence in a harsh desert, but rather people who found themselves in one of the most productive and hospitable environments that humans had ever encountered. Picture these early Saharan peoples as they first gazed across vast grasslands that stretched to every horizon, dotted with acacia groves and scattered herds of wildlife so abundant that hunting success was virtually guaranteed. The ease of life in the Green Sahara must have seemed almost magical to people whose ancestors had spent generations competing for limited resources in more crowded regions, suddenly finding themselves in landscapes where game was plentiful, water was abundant, and the living was remarkably easy. The archaeological evidence left by these ancient Saharan peoples reveals communities that developed sophisticated technologies and cultural practices specifically adapted to life in the abundant grassland and lake environments. Their tools included specialized fishing equipment for harvesting the abundant aquatic resources, hunting weapons designed for the large game that roamed the savannas, and processing tools for working with the diverse plant and animal resources that the Green Sahara provided in such abundance. As you rest comfortably tonight, you can imagine the peaceful camps of these ancient peoples, perhaps situated on low hills overlooking lakes where abundant waterfowl provided easy hunting, or along rivers where fish could be caught with simple traps and nets. The sounds of their camps would have blended harmoniously with the natural sounds of the abundant ecosystem. Children playing near the water's edge, adults working hides or preparing tools, the gentle conversations of people whose lives were made easy by the natural abundance that surrounded them. The rock art that these ancient Saharan peoples created provides a vivid record of the wildlife and landscapes that surrounded them, depicting scenes of abundance that seem almost fantastical when viewed against today's desert backdrop. Giraffes stretch their necks to reach acacia leaves. Elephants march in long processions across grasslands. Cattle graze peacefully near permanent water sources, and hunters pursue antelope through landscapes filled with life. Picture the artists who created these rock paintings working carefully in the shade of overhanging rocks, using pigments made from local minerals to record the scenes of abundance that filled their daily lives. These were not symbolic or religious images, but rather naturalistic depictions of the everyday reality of life in the Green Sahara. Hunting scenes, pastoral activities, and wildlife observations that documented one of the most remarkable human adaptations to a changing environment. The fishing cultures that developed around the Great Lakes of the ancient Sahara created some of the most sophisticated aquatic technologies that early humans ever developed. Bone harpoons designed for catching large fish, elaborate nets for harvesting smaller species, and specialized boats for navigating the vast lake systems demonstrate the technological innovation that abundant aquatic resources inspired in these ancient fishing peoples. Imagine the daily life of these fishing communities, with families launching boats into the calm morning waters of ancient lakes, setting nets in productive areas, and returning in the evening with catches so abundant that food security was never a concern. The social organization of these communities would have revolved around the seasonal patterns of fish availability, with periods of intensive fishing during spawning seasons alternating with more relaxed periods when preserved fish provided adequate nutrition. The hunting cultures that specialized in pursuing the abundant terrestrial wildlife developed techniques and technologies specifically adapted to the open grassland environments that characterized much of the Green Sahara. Hunting strategies included cooperative drives that took advantage of the open terrain to pursue herds across vast distances, while individual hunting techniques focused on the abundant smaller game that provided consistent protein sources. Picture hunting parties moving quietly through the tall grass of ancient Saharan savannas, following well-worn game trails to water sources where abundant wildlife provided reliable hunting opportunities. The success of these hunting activities would have been so consistent that much of the community's time could be devoted to other activities: social interaction, technological innovation, artistic expression, and the gradual development of more complex cultural practices. The gathering activities that supplemented hunting and fishing provided access to the diverse plant resources that the Green Sahara's abundant ecosystems produced. Wild grains, fruits, nuts, and roots were available in such variety and abundance that plant foods could provide a substantial portion of the diet while requiring relatively little effort to harvest and process. The seasonal round of activities that characterized life in the Green Sahara followed the natural rhythms of abundance that the enhanced monsoon climate provided. Wet seasons brought optimal hunting conditions as game concentrated around abundant water sources, while dry seasons provided ideal conditions for processing and preserving the surplus food that the productive environment made possible. Consider the social implications of life in such an abundant environment, where food security was rarely a concern and communities had the leisure time necessary for cultural development. The reduced stress of resource competition allowed for the development of more complex social structures, elaborate artistic traditions, and the technological innovations that would eventually lead to significant advances in human civilization. The technological innovations that emerged from life in the Green Sahara included advances in pottery making for food storage and preparation, developments in tool manufacturing that took advantage of local stone and metal resources, and innovations in shelter construction that utilized the diverse building materials that the abundant ecosystems provided. Picture these ancient communities developing new technologies not out of desperate necessity, but from the creative impulse that comes with having basic needs securely met and time available for experimentation and innovation. Pottery designs became more elaborate, tools became more specialized, and shelter construction became more sophisticated as communities had the resources and leisure time necessary for technological advancement. The animal domestication that began during the Green Sahara period represents one of the most significant developments in human history, made possible by the abundance of both wild animals suitable for domestication and the plant resources necessary to feed domestic herds. Cattle domestication in particular flourished in the grassland environments that provided abundant forage, while the reliable water sources made permanent settlements possible. Imagine the gradual process of cattle domestication as human communities began selectively managing wild aurochs populations, protecting calves from predators, providing supplemental feeding during difficult periods, and gradually developing the close relationships with domestic animals that would transform both human society and the animals themselves. The agricultural experiments that began in the Green Sahara included early cultivation of wild grains and other plants that grew abundantly in the natural grassland communities. These early agricultural activities were supplemental to hunting, fishing, and gathering rather than replacing these traditional subsistence strategies, allowing for gradual experimentation with plant cultivation techniques. Picture small gardens established near permanent water sources where experimental cultivation could be maintained with minimal effort, allowing communities to explore agricultural techniques while still relying primarily on the abundant natural resources that the Green Sahara environment provided. These early agricultural experiments laid the groundwork for the farming techniques that would eventually spread across Africa. The trade networks that developed between different communities across the vast expanse of the Green Sahara facilitated the exchange of specialized resources, technological innovations, and cultural practices. The abundance of resources in most areas meant that trade focused on particularly valuable items rather than basic necessities, allowing for the development of long-distance exchange relationships. The cultural developments that flourished during the Green Sahara period included elaborate artistic traditions, complex burial practices, and sophisticated social organizations that reflected the security and abundance that characterized life in these productive environments. Communities had the resources and leisure time necessary for cultural elaboration that would have been impossible under more stressful survival conditions. Consider the psychological and social effects of living in such abundance, where the constant stress of resource competition was replaced by the security of knowing that food, water, and other necessities were readily available. This security allowed for the development of more cooperative social structures and the cultural innovations that characterize human civilization. The population growth that occurred during the Green Sahara period reflects the carrying capacity of these abundant ecosystems, with archaeological evidence suggesting that human populations reached densities that would not be seen again in the Saharan region until modern times. The ability to support larger populations provided the demographic foundation for cultural complexity and technological innovation. The settlement patterns that developed during the Green Sahara period included both permanent villages near reliable water sources and seasonal camps that followed the movements of herds and the availability of different resources. This flexibility in settlement organization allowed communities to take maximum advantage of the diverse opportunities that the abundant environment provided. Picture permanent settlements situated on elevated areas overlooking lakes or rivers, with substantial houses and storage facilities that reflected the security and abundance of life in the Green Sahara. These settlements would have been surrounded by areas of intensive resource use, with fishing areas, hunting grounds, gathering locations, and eventually agricultural plots, all within easy reach of the residential areas. The social complexity that developed during the Green Sahara period included specialized roles within communities, with some individuals focusing on hunting, others on fishing, still others on gathering or early agricultural activities. This specialization was possible because of the abundance of resources that allowed communities to support individuals who were not directly involved in food production. The cultural continuity that connected Green Sahara populations with both their ancestors and their descendants demonstrates the remarkable adaptability of human societies to changing environmental conditions. As the climate gradually shifted from arid to humid and eventually back to arid again, human populations adapted their technologies, settlement patterns, and subsistence strategies while maintaining cultural continuity across these dramatic environmental changes. The legacy of the Green Sahara period in human development includes technological innovations, cultural practices, and genetic contributions that influenced the subsequent development of African civilizations. The cattle pastoralism that developed during this period eventually spread across much of Africa, while agricultural techniques and cultural practices that originated in the Green Sahara influenced civilizations throughout the continent. Tonight, as you settle into deeper rest, you can imagine the peaceful sounds of these ancient human communities, the laughter of children playing by abundant water sources, the quiet conversations of adults working on tools and crafts, the songs and stories that celebrated life in a landscape of unprecedented abundance. These first Saharan peoples remind us that human adaptability and cultural creativity flourish most remarkably when basic needs are securely met and communities have the leisure time necessary for innovation and cultural development. Like a gentle tide that has reached its highest point and begins its patient retreat back to the sea, the transformation of the Green Sahara back toward desert conditions unfolded with the same gradual persistence that had brought abundance to the region thousands of years earlier. This was not a sudden collapse or catastrophic change, but rather a slow goodbye that extended over centuries, allowing the rich ecosystems and human communities that had flourished during the humid period to adapt, migrate, or find refuge in increasingly scattered favorable locations as the orbital cycles that had enhanced monsoon circulation gradually shifted back toward patterns that reduced rainfall across the vast Saharan expanse. Picture this transformation beginning almost imperceptibly, perhaps with occasional years when the rains came a little later than usual, or seasons when the dry period extended a few weeks longer than the previous year. These subtle changes would have been barely noticeable to individual observers, lost within the normal variation that characterizes any climate system. Yet they represented the beginning of a profound transformation that would eventually return the world's most productive grassland to the arid conditions that we associate with the Sahara today. The orbital mechanics that drove this gradual drying operated according to the same astronomical cycles that had brought enhanced rainfall to the region, but now moving in the opposite direction as Earth's relationship with the Sun slowly shifted away from the configuration that had strengthened monsoon circulation. The closer approach to the Sun during Northern Hemisphere summers that had enhanced thermal contrasts and drawn moisture far inland was gradually weakening as orbital cycles continued their ancient dance. As you rest comfortably tonight, you can imagine how this astronomical forcing worked its patient influence on atmospheric circulation patterns, gradually reducing the thermal contrast that drove monsoon circulation while slowly shifting precipitation patterns southward toward the regions where modern monsoons still bring seasonal rainfall. The changes occurred so gradually that they were spread across hundreds of human generations, allowing adaptation and adjustment rather than forcing sudden abandonment. The first signs of drying appeared in the marginal areas at the northern and eastern edges of the Green Sahara, where rainfall had always been lighter and more variable than in the core regions of abundance. These borderland areas began experiencing more frequent dry years and longer dry seasons, creating stress on vegetation communities that had established themselves during the most favorable climatic periods. Picture the gradual retreat of grasslands from these marginal areas, with the boundaries between green savanna and more arid conditions slowly shifting southward as rainfall patterns changed. This retreat was not a uniform withdrawal, but rather a complex process of advance and retreat as individual wet and dry years created temporary reversals in the overall drying trend, allowing occasional recolonization of areas that were gradually becoming unsuitable for permanent vegetation. The plant communities that had flourished during the height of the Green Sahara began showing the first responses to changing moisture conditions through subtle shifts in species composition and productivity. Drought-sensitive species became less common and eventually disappeared from many areas, while more drought-tolerant species expanded their ranges and became increasingly dominant in the changing vegetation communities. The gradual changes in plant communities created cascading effects throughout the food webs that had developed during the humid period, with herbivore populations beginning to experience reduced food quality and availability as grasslands became less productive and woody browse became more important in their diets. These changes in herbivore populations then affected the predator communities that depended on abundant prey populations. Imagine the subtle behavioral changes that began appearing in animal populations as resource availability gradually declined, changes in migration patterns as animals began traveling farther to find adequate food and water, changes in social organization as competition for resources slowly intensified, and changes in reproductive success as environmental stress began affecting population growth rates. The great herds of elephants that had roamed freely across vast grasslands began concentrating their activities around the most reliable water sources as seasonal streams became less dependable and permanent rivers began carrying reduced flows. These concentrations created increased pressure on vegetation around water sources, while reducing the availability of resources in areas that were becoming too dry to support year-round elephant populations. The lake systems that had provided such abundant aquatic resources began experiencing more pronounced seasonal water level fluctuations as inflow from reduced rainfall failed to match evaporation losses. The largest lakes maintained their basic structure for centuries, but gradually contracted in size, while smaller lakes began experiencing periodic complete drying during extended dry seasons. Picture the gradual retreat of shorelines as water levels slowly dropped, exposing mudflats and former lake beds that began supporting terrestrial vegetation while reducing the aquatic habitat available for fish and waterbird populations. These changes occurred slowly enough that aquatic communities could gradually adapt to smaller habitat areas. But the overall trend toward reduced aquatic resources was inexorable. The fish populations that had thrived in abundant lake systems began experiencing population pressures as their habitat gradually contracted, with some species becoming extinct in smaller lakes, while others maintained populations in the largest water bodies that persisted longest. The fishing communities that had depended on abundant aquatic resources began supplementing their diet with increased hunting and gathering activities. The waterbird populations that had created some of the most spectacular wildlife concentrations in the Green Sahara began showing changes in their seasonal patterns and population sizes as aquatic habitat became less reliable. Some species shifted their migration routes to take advantage of water sources that remained more dependable, while others experienced population declines as breeding habitat became increasingly scarce. Consider how the human communities that had flourished in the abundant Green Sahara began adapting to these gradually changing conditions through subtle modifications in their subsistence strategies, settlement patterns, and social organization. These adaptations were evolutionary rather than revolutionary, allowing cultures to maintain continuity while adjusting to slowly changing environmental conditions. The agricultural experiments that had begun during the abundant period became increasingly important as wild food resources became less reliable, with communities investing more effort in plant cultivation and animal domestication as supplements to hunting, fishing, and gathering. These technological adaptations helped buffer the effects of environmental change while creating the foundation for agricultural societies. Picture the gradual intensification of agricultural activities as communities began devoting more land and labor to food production while developing more sophisticated techniques for water management and soil conservation. These agricultural innovations represented adaptive responses to changing environmental conditions rather than sudden technological revolutions. The animal domestication that had begun with cattle management became increasingly important as wild game populations began declining due to habitat changes and increased hunting pressure from growing human populations concentrated around shrinking resource areas. Domestic animals provided more reliable protein sources than increasingly unpredictable hunting success. The trade networks that had developed during the abundant period began carrying different types of goods as communities in different areas specialized in producing resources that remained locally abundant while importing resources that were becoming scarce in their own regions. These trade relationships helped maintain cultural connections as environmental changes created increasing regional differences in resource availability. The settlement patterns that had included both permanent villages and seasonal camps began shifting toward greater mobility as resources became more dispersed and less predictable. Communities developed more sophisticated strategies for seasonal movement that allowed them to track changing resource availability while maintaining social cohesion. Picture the gradual evolution of more nomadic lifestyles as communities learned to move their entire social organization in response to seasonal and annual variation in resource availability, developing portable technologies and flexible social structures that could adapt to increasingly variable environmental conditions. The technological innovations that emerged during this transition period included improved techniques for food storage and preservation, more efficient hunting and gathering technologies, and innovations in water location and management that became increasingly important as reliable water sources became more scattered across the landscape. The cultural adaptations that allowed human societies to maintain continuity through environmental change included the development of more sophisticated ecological knowledge, flexible social institutions that could function under variable conditions, and cultural practices that emphasize cooperation and resource sharing during times of scarcity. Consider how these gradual environmental changes created selection pressures that favored cultural practices emphasizing adaptability, cooperation, and efficient resource use, while discouraging practices that required predictable abundance or permanent settlement in single locations. The wildlife migrations that began developing as environmental conditions changed created new patterns of animal movement that connected areas of seasonal abundance, while allowing species to track favorable conditions across the gradually changing landscape. These migration patterns helped maintain wildlife populations while they adapted to changing environmental conditions. The refuge areas that remained favorable longer than surrounding regions became concentration points for both wildlife and human populations, creating increased competition for resources while serving as reservoirs from which recolonization could occur if conditions improved. These refugia played crucial roles in maintaining biological and cultural diversity through the transition period. Picture oases and highland areas where springs maintained flow and vegetation remained green long after surrounding areas had returned to arid conditions, creating islands of abundance that supported concentrated populations of plants, animals, and humans while serving as stepping stones for movement across increasingly arid landscapes. The timing of this drying process varied across different parts of the Green Sahara, with some areas experiencing aridification several centuries before others, creating a complex mosaic of environmental change that allowed gradual population shifts and species movements rather than simultaneous abandonment of the entire region. The final stages of the transition to arid conditions occurred approximately 5,000 years ago, marking the end of one of the most remarkable periods of abundance and biological diversity that the Saharan region had ever experienced. By this time, most of the Green Sahara had returned to the desert conditions that characterize the region today. The memory of this abundant period persisted in the cultural traditions of peoples who had lived through the transition, passed down through oral histories and artistic traditions that preserve knowledge of the time when the desert had been green. These cultural memories influenced the development of civilizations that emerged in areas that remained habitable after the drying was complete. Tonight, as you drift toward deeper rest, you can imagine the bittersweet beauty of this slow goodbye, the gradual retreat of green grasslands, the patient withdrawal of abundant waters, the gentle migration of wildlife toward areas that could still support them, and the adaptive ingenuity of human communities learning to thrive under changing conditions. This transformation reminds us that environmental change, even when it leads toward less favorable conditions, can unfold with sufficient gentleness to allow adaptation and cultural continuity rather than catastrophic disruption. Buried beneath the golden dunes and scattered across the rocky plateaus of today's Sahara Desert lie countless traces of the ancient green paradise that once flourished where now only sand and stone mark the horizon. Archaeological treasures that speak to patient scientific eyes about lives lived in abundance, communities that thrive beside vanished lakes, and technologies developed to harvest the rich resources of landscapes that today seem almost lifeless. These echoes in the sand represent a vast outdoor museum scattered across millions of square miles, where every expedition reveals new evidence of the remarkable transformation that converted Earth's largest desert into one of its most productive ecosystems and back again. Picture archaeological teams working carefully in the early morning coolness, brushing sand away from artifacts that have lain hidden for thousands of years, each discovery adding another piece to the puzzle of life in the ancient Green Sahara. The patience required for this work mirrors the patience of the natural processes that created and preserved these archaeological treasures, with each carefully excavated layer revealing new evidence of the abundant life that once characterized this now arid region. The stone tools scattered across ancient loch shores tell stories of fishing communities that developed sophisticated technologies for harvesting aquatic resources that no longer exist in the modern Sahara. Bone harpoons designed for catching large fish, net weights crafted from carefully selected stones, and fish hooks carved from animal bones provide tangible evidence of the abundant aquatic life that supported human communities for thousands of years. As you rest peacefully tonight, You can imagine these ancient fishing tools being crafted beside permanent water sources, their makers sitting in the shade of trees that lined lake shores, working bone and stone into implements designed to harvest the abundant fish populations that filled waters now buried beneath hundreds of feet of sand. Each tool represents hours of skilled work by artisans who never imagined that their fishing grounds would one day become the world's largest desert. The pottery sherds that lie scattered across ancient settlement sites reveal sophisticated ceramic traditions that developed in response to the abundant food resources that required storage and processing. Large storage vessels speak of communities that could accumulate surplus food resources, while decorated serving bowls indicate societies with the leisure time necessary for artistic elaboration and cultural development. Picture the pottery workshops of ancient Saharan communities, with skilled ceramicists shaping clay vessels beside permanent water sources, decorating their work with intricate patterns that reflected the cultural traditions of people whose lives were made secure by the abundance that surrounded them. The clay for these vessels came from the rich soils that formed during the humid period, soils that contained the organic matter necessary for successful ceramic production. The grinding stones and mortars found at archaeological sites across the Sahara provide evidence of the diverse plant foods that supplemented hunting and fishing activities during the Green Sahara period. These tools were designed to process wild grains, nuts, and roots that grew abundantly in the productive grassland and woodland ecosystems, demonstrating the botanical diversity that characterized ancient Saharan plant communities. The rock art galleries that preserve thousands of images of ancient Saharan life represent perhaps the most vivid evidence of the abundant wildlife and pastoral activities that characterize the humid period. These artistic traditions developed over thousands of years, creating detailed records of hunting scenes, pastoral activities, and wildlife observations that document the gradual changes in fauna and human activities as environmental conditions slowly changed. Imagine the ancient artists who created these rock paintings working in the cool shade of overhanging rocks, mixing pigment from local minerals to create images that would preserve for thousands of years the memory of elephants, giraffes, rhinoceros, and countless other species that roamed landscapes where today only scattered desert-adapted animals survive. The animal bones found at archaeological sites provide quantitative evidence of the species that lived in the ancient Sahara, with careful analysis revealing not only which animals were present, but also their relative abundance and the seasonal patterns of their availability to human hunters. Elephant bones found hundreds of miles from the nearest water source in today's desert demonstrate the vastly different environmental conditions that once existed. Picture archaeologists carefully excavating ancient garbage dumps and cooking areas, sorting through animal bones that tell stories of successful hunts and abundant meals, each bone fragment providing evidence of the wildlife populations that supported human communities in landscapes that today cannot support even the most drought-adapted wild animals. The human skeletal remains discovered at Saharan archaeological sites reveal populations that were generally well-nourished and healthy, reflecting the abundant food resources and favorable living conditions that characterize the Green Sahara period. Studies of ancient DNA from these remains provide insights into the population movements and genetic relationships that connected Saharan peoples with other African populations. The burial practices evidenced at these sites indicate complex cultural traditions that included elaborate grave goods, careful body positioning, and monument construction that reflect societies with the resources and leisure time necessary for sophisticated mortuary rituals. These burial traditions provide insights into the spiritual beliefs and social organization of ancient Saharan peoples. Consider the preserved remains of ancient settlements, where mud brick foundations and stone circles mark the locations of substantial houses and community structures that were built to last for generations rather than the temporary shelters that might be expected in a marginal environment. These permanent settlements reflect the security and stability that abundant resources provided to ancient Saharan communities. The agricultural terraces and irrigation channels found in highland areas of the Sahara provide evidence of the farming activities that supplemented hunting, fishing, and gathering during the later phases of the humid period. These agricultural features demonstrate the technological innovations that allowed communities to intensify food production as wild resources became less abundant. Picture ancient farmers working these terraced fields during the rainy season, planting crops in soils enriched by thousands of years of organic matter accumulation, tending plants that would supplement the still abundant hunting and fishing opportunities that the green Sahara environment provided. The ancient shorelines that can still be traced around the basins of vanished lakes provide dramatic evidence of the scale of aquatic systems that once existed in the Sahara. These fossil shorelines, marked by beach deposits and wave-cut terraces, indicate water levels that were maintained for centuries or millennia, demonstrating the stability and persistence of ancient lake systems. The fossilized wood found scattered across the modern desert comes from trees that grew during the humid period, providing evidence of the woodland communities that developed in areas with especially favorable moisture conditions. Analysis of this fossil wood reveals tree species that today grow only in tropical regions hundreds of miles to the south. Imagine vast groves of these ancient trees providing shade and shelter across landscapes that today know only the scattered thorny shrubs that can survive on minimal rainfall. Their fossil remains now serving as monuments to the remarkable vegetation communities that once characterized Saharan highlands and riparian areas. The pollen preserved in ancient lake sediments provides detailed records of vegetation changes throughout the Green Sahara period, revealing not only which plant species were present, but also their relative abundance and the timing of their appearance and disappearance as climate conditions changed. This pollen evidence creates detailed timelines of ecological change that span thousands of years. The paleosols, ancient soil layers that lie buried beneath modern sand dunes, provide evidence of the rich, organic soils that formed during the humid period through thousands of years of vegetation growth and organic matter accumulation. These buried soils represent some of the richest earth that ever existed in the Saharan region. Picture soil scientists carefully excavating these ancient soil layers, revealing dark, organic rich earth that once supported abundant grasslands and woodlands in areas that today receive virtually no rainfall. The chemical analysis of these paleosols reveals the nutrient cycles and biological processes that supported some of Africa's most productive ecosystems. The tool-making sites scattered across the Sahara reveal the locations where ancient peoples manufactured stone implements, with discarded flakes and broken tools providing evidence of the technological traditions that developed in response to the abundant resources and diverse raw materials that the Green Sahara environment provided. The trade goods found at Saharan archaeological sites include materials that originated hundreds or thousands of miles away, demonstrating the long-distance exchange networks that connected ancient Saharan communities with peoples across Africa and potentially beyond. These trade relationships were facilitated by the abundant local resources that allowed communities to specialize in producing goods for exchange. Consider the preservation conditions that have protected these archaeological treasures for thousands of years, with the arid climate that characterizes the modern Sahara providing ideal conditions for preserving organic materials, artifacts, and even human remains that would have long since decomposed in more humid environments. The satellite imagery that reveals ancient river channels, lake basins, and settlement patterns beneath modern sand dunes demonstrates how technological advances continue to reveal new evidence of green Sahara environments and human activities. Ground-penetrating radar and other geophysical techniques allow archaeologists to locate buried sites without excavation. Picture satellites passing overhead, their sensors penetrating sand dunes to reveal the buried channels of ancient rivers and the foundations of settlements that were abandoned thousands of years ago when changing climate conditions made permanent occupation impossible. These remote sensing techniques continue to reveal new archaeological sites across the vast expanse of the Sahara. The conservation challenges facing Saharan archaeology include the effects of modern climate change, increased human activity, and the natural processes of sand movement that continue to bury and expose archaeological sites. International cooperation efforts work to document and protect these irreplaceable records of ancient human adaptation to environmental change. The scientific techniques that archaeologists use to extract maximum information from Saharan sites include radiocarbon dating to establish precise chronologies, isotopic analysis to understand ancient diets and migration patterns, and computer modeling to reconstruct ancient environmental conditions and human population dynamics. The ongoing discoveries that continue to emerge from Saharan archaeology regularly revise our understanding of ancient human adaptations, technological developments, and environmental changes. Each new site provides additional evidence of the complexity and sophistication of societies that flourished in the ancient Green Sahara. The educational value of Saharan archaeology extends beyond academic research to provide insights into human adaptability, environmental change, and the relationship between climate and civilization that have relevance for understanding modern environmental challenges and human responses to changing conditions. The international collaborations that characterize modern Saharan archaeology bring together researchers from Africa, Europe, and North America to study these archaeological treasures, creating partnerships that enhance both scientific understanding and local capacity for archaeological research and heritage preservation. Tonight, as you settle into deeper rest, you can imagine these archaeological treasures lying patiently beneath the sand, each artifact a tangible connection to the lives of people who experienced one of the most remarkable environmental transformations in human history. These echoes in the sand remind us that landscapes preserve the memory of their past abundance, waiting for patient scientific investigation to reveal the stories of adaptation, innovation, and resilience that characterize human life during the ancient Green Sahara period. As our gentle journey through the ancient Green Sahara draws toward its peaceful conclusion, we can step back to appreciate the profound lesson that this remarkable transformation teaches us about the dynamic nature of our planet's climate system and the cyclical patterns that govern environmental change over timescales that dwarf human experience. The Green Sahara represents not an isolated anomaly in Earth's history, but rather one movement in a vast symphony of climate cycles that have repeated many times over millions of years, driven by the patient astronomical forces that continue to influence our planet's long-term climate patterns with the same reliability that governs the daily rising and setting of the sun. Picture Earth as it moves through its ancient orbital dance with gravitational partners that include not only the Sun, but also the Moon, Jupiter, and the other planetary bodies whose collective influence creates the subtle variations in orbital shape, axial tilt, and rotational orientation that drive long-term climate cycles. These astronomical influences operate with clockwork precision over periods of tens of thousands of years, creating climate rhythms that are as predictable as they are profound in their environmental effects. The Milankovitch cycles that govern these long-term climate patterns include variations in Earth's orbital eccentricity that change the shape of our planet's orbit from more circular to more elliptical over periods of about 100,000 years, variations in axial tilt that affect the intensity of seasonal differences over periods of about 41,000 years, and variations in the precession of Earth's axis that change which season occurs when Earth is closest to the Sun over periods of about 23,000 years. As you rest comfortably tonight, you can imagine these astronomical cycles as vast, gentle clockwork mechanisms that govern climate change over timescales so long that thousands of human generations might live and die within a single cycle. Yet these mechanisms operate with such reliability that scientists can calculate their effects millions of years into the past and future with remarkable precision. The Green Sahara that we have explored represents just one recent example of how these orbital cycles can transform landscapes, but geological evidence reveals that similar transformations have occurred many times throughout Earth's history. Marine sediment cores from the Mediterranean Sea and Atlantic Ocean show alternating layers of dust and organic matter that mark repeated cycles of Saharan aridity and humidity extending back millions of years. Picture these sediment cores as libraries that preserve detailed records of environmental change, with each layer representing a snapshot of environmental conditions during a particular time period. The dust layers mark periods when the Sahara was arid and wind-blown sediments reached the ocean, while organic-rich layers mark periods when the Sahara was green and less dust reached marine environments. The regularity of these cycles demonstrates that the Green Sahara was not a unique event, but rather part of a natural rhythm that has transformed North African landscapes repeatedly throughout geological time. Approximately every 20 to 23,000 years, orbital configurations align to enhance monsoon circulation and bring green conditions to the Saharan region, followed by gradual returns to aridity as orbital cycles continue their ancient progression. The vegetation records preserved in these sediment cores reveal that each green period brought similar ecological transformations, with grasslands, woodlands, and lake systems developing across the Saharan region during favorable orbital configurations, then gradually retreating as conditions became more arid. These repeated transformations demonstrate the remarkable resilience and adaptability of ecological systems when environmental changes occur at natural timescales. Consider the implications of this cyclical pattern for understanding the true nature of the landscapes we see today. The modern Sahara, despite its appearance of permanent aridity, represents just one phase in a continuing cycle of environmental change that will eventually bring green conditions back to the region when orbital cycles align favorably in the future. The mathematical precision with which scientists can calculate future orbital configurations allows them to predict that the next Green Sahara period will begin in approximately 15,000 years, when changes in axial precession will again enhance summer solar heating in the northern hemisphere and strengthen monsoon circulation enough to bring regular rainfall to the Saharan region. Picture this future transformation unfolding with the same gradual persistence that characterized past green periods, beginning with occasional wet years in marginal areas and gradually expanding into full grassland and lake systems that will support abundant wildlife and human populations for thousands of years before the next orbital shift initiates another gradual return to arid conditions. The wildlife communities that will colonize the future Green Sahara will likely include many of the same species that flourished during past green periods, as plant and animal populations that currently survive in refuge areas to the south will gradually expand their ranges northward as climate conditions become favorable. This biological resilience demonstrates the remarkable capacity of life to respond to favorable environmental changes when they occur at appropriate timescales. The human societies that will experience the next Green Sahara transformation will face opportunities and challenges similar to those experienced by ancient peoples, but with the advantage of modern scientific understanding of climate cycles and environmental change. This knowledge could allow future societies to plan more effectively for both the green period itself and its eventual conclusion. The paleoclimate research that has revealed these long-term cycles provides crucial insights into the relationship between astronomical forcing and climate response, demonstrating how relatively small changes in solar energy distribution can create dramatic environmental transformations through complex feedback mechanisms involving atmospheric circulation, vegetation, and surface hydrology. Picture paleoclimatologists working with sediment cores, ice cores, tree rings, and other climate archives to reconstruct detailed records of past environmental changes, each analysis adding to our understanding of how Earth's climate system responds to orbital forcing over long time scales. This research provides essential context for understanding both natural climate variability and human influences on climate systems. The climate models that scientists use to study these orbital cycles demonstrate remarkable agreement between predicted climate responses to astronomical forcing and observed paleoclimate records, providing confidence in our understanding of the physical mechanisms that drive long-term climate change. These models also help scientists understand how human activities might interact with natural climate cycles. The current interglacial period in which we live represents another example of orbital climate forcing, with the same astronomical cycles that drive Saharan green periods also controlling the advance and retreat of continental ice sheets that create ice ages and interglacial periods. We currently live during a warm interglacial period that began about 11,000 years ago, approximately the same time as the most recent Green Sahara period. Consider how the recognition of these natural climate cycles provides perspective on the timescales and mechanisms of climate change, demonstrating that Earth's climate system is naturally dynamic and capable of dramatic transformations when appropriate forcing mechanisms operate over sufficient time periods. This understanding helps distinguish between natural climate variability and human-induced climate change. The philosophical implications of understanding climate cycles extend beyond scientific knowledge to influence how we think about the relationship between human societies and environmental change. The recognition that landscapes can transform dramatically over long timescales while maintaining the potential for renewal provides both humility about human permanence and hope for environmental resilience. The conservation implications of understanding Saharan climate cycles include recognition that current refuge areas for Saharan wildlife represent reservoirs from which future recolonization can occur when favorable climate conditions return. Protecting these refuge areas ensures that the biological diversity necessary for future green Sahara ecosystems will be available when orbital cycles again favor humid conditions. Picture the scattered oases, highland areas, and southern margin ecosystems that currently preserve remnant populations of species that once ranged widely across green Saharan landscapes. Each refuge area representing a seed bank of biological diversity that waits patiently for the return of favorable climate conditions that will allow range expansion back into currently arid regions. The cultural implications of understanding climate cycles include appreciation for the adaptive strategies that have allowed human societies to persist through multiple cycles of environmental change, developing flexible technologies, social organizations, and knowledge systems that can function under varying environmental conditions. The archaeological record demonstrates that human societies have successfully adapted to multiple transitions between arid and humid conditions in the Saharan region, developing cultural practices and technologies that enabled survival and prosperity under both environmental regimes. This cultural resilience provides insights into human adaptability that have relevance for modern environmental challenges. The educational value of understanding Saharan climate cycles extends beyond academic knowledge to provide practical insights into the nature of environmental change, the relationship between astronomical forcing and climate response, and the timescales over which natural systems operate. This knowledge helps develop more sophisticated understanding of climate systems and environmental change. The international cooperation that characterizes modern paleoclimate research brings together scientists from many nations to study climate archives from around the world, creating collaborative networks that enhance understanding of global climate systems while building scientific capacity in regions where climate change impacts are most significant. The technological advances that continue to improve paleoclimate research include new analytical techniques for extracting environmental information from climate archives, improved dating methods for establishing precise chronologies, and enhanced computer models for simulating climate responses to orbital forcing and other environmental changes. The future research directions in Saharan paleoclimatology include higher resolution studies of past climate changes, improved understanding of the ecological and hydrological processes that respond to orbital forcing, and better integration of paleoclimate data with climate models to enhance prediction of future environmental changes. The broader climate context in which Saharan cycles operate includes global patterns of orbital climate forcing that affect not only North Africa, but all regions of Earth, creating coordinated environmental changes that demonstrate the interconnected nature of global climate systems. Understanding these global connections helps appreciate how regional environmental changes fit within larger patterns of climate variability. The inspiration that comes from understanding Earth's capacity for landscape transformation provides hope for environmental renewal and appreciation for the dynamic nature of natural systems. The knowledge that current desert landscapes retain the potential for future abundance encourages both conservation efforts and optimism about nature's resilience. Tonight, as our journey through the ancient green Sahara reaches its gentle conclusion, You can rest peacefully in the knowledge that the same orbital cycles that brought abundance to ancient deserts continue their patient work, guaranteeing that Earth's landscapes will continue transforming in response to astronomical rhythms that operate with the reliability of celestial clockwork. The Green Sahara reminds us that our planet breathes with vast, slow rhythms that dwarf human timescales, yet demonstrate the remarkable capacity for renewal that lies dormant in landscapes that patience and orbital mechanics will eventually awaken. As sleep approaches and consciousness gently fades, let the story of the Green Sahara provide comfort in the knowledge that Earth's natural systems operate according to cycles of renewal that have persisted for millions of years and will continue far into the future. The desert that seems permanent today carries within it the seeds of future abundance, waiting for the return of orbital conditions that will again transform sand into grassland, bring back the ancient lakes, and restore the paradise that patient astronomical cycles will surely provide when Earth's dance with the sun once again aligns to bring life to landscapes that now dream beneath the desert stars. Sweet dreams of green, Saharan tomorrows, when the desert blooms again,